Let's talk about rust and why cars don't seem to do that anymore. I'm John Cadogan from AutoExpert.com.au, the place where Aussie new car buyers save thousands off their next new cars. Hit me up on the website for that. We're here in the great Australian bugger all today, shooting a piece for tomorrow. But while we're here, let's talk about rust. Got a question from Anthony of Belfield who says, one of the reasons for purchasing either the Hyundai or Kia are the unlimited kilometre warranties. The manufacturers are betting the cars will be warranted against defects regardless of distance travelled for 5 years or 7 years. My question is about the metalwork body guarantee. From my basic knowledge of chemistry, do these cars use a sacrificial anode made of zinc in the same way a domestic hot water heater or the Sydney Opera House are protected by a sacrificial anode against corrosion? Or is that Hyundai's or Kia's steel is better manufactured? So let's talk about that. Basically, for about the past 30 years or something, cars have been galvanised, as in hot dip galvanised. At least the steel used to make the panels has been. And I'm talking here about the developed world. So even today, I think a lot of cars made for the domestic markets of China and India are without galvanisation, and they kind of perform the same as the cars around here did in the 70s, which is that they rust really easily. You get those bubbles of rust after only a few years. But modern cars don't seem to do that, and they haven't seemed to have done that for about 30 years, and it's really easy to understand why. It's because the steel used to manufacture them is hot dip galvanised right at the end of the steel manufacturing process. So essentially galvanising is that whole sacrificial anode thing that Anthony's talking about, only they don't use a big fat chunk of zinc sort of bolted to the body or something like they might with a ship or an oil rig or a really long pipeline, transcontinental pipeline for oil or something. What they do instead is they coat the entire surface of the steel with a really thin layer of zinc. And what happens is there's an electrolytic reaction between the zinc and the iron in the steel. And what that basically means is because zinc is more active than the underlying steel, the zinc sacrifices itself so that the steel might live for longer. Now, that doesn't mean that the steel won't corrode, and it really does depend on the operational environment of the steel. The zinc will protect the steel for as long as the zinc is available. So if you live in a part of the world, North America comes to mind, the northern parts of North America and North America, where it gets really, really cold in winter. They use a lot of salt on the roads, obviously, to deal with the ice and the grip factor. And the downside of that is it's a really good electrolyte, and that just speeds up the corrosion process. So if the zinc is going to last for, 20 years here in Australia, then the zinc is probably only going to last for 5 years or maybe 10 years in North America. It really depends on the process. But basically, the zinc is going to sacrifice itself so that the steel might live for as long as the zinc is in place. And this is saliently different than the can of food that we're all used to, particularly you bachelors out there. The can of food, this one's obviously seen better days. Anyway, they use tin in a tin can. And the salient difference between tin and zinc is that tin is less active than the underlying iron. So when you think about a tin can, what the tin is there to do is to fully coat the steel and prevent any oxygen from getting to it. If you scratch the steel or there's any kind of defect that gets through the tin, the steel will start to rust. And not only that, it rusts a whole lot faster than it would rust in the absence of the tin, because the steel the iron is the most active part of the whole assembly in a tin can, and the iron will sacrifice itself in that case so that the tin may live for longer, which is exactly what you don't want. So don't be using any sort of old tin cans for anything out there in the great outdoors that needs to resist corrosion, because quite simply, it won't. At the risk of delving way too deep into a subject that could be the miracle cure for insomnia that we've all been looking for, there's some interesting things happening with the steels that they use in cars and the galvanising going on right now. So you might seem to think that engineers are a whole bunch of propeller-headed dweebs who just sit around and do nerdy calculations and stuff, but there's actually a whole bunch of them who do lobbying, like for the aluminium industry or the zinc industry or the steel industry or whatever. And the aluminium industry and the steel industry are typically way at war with each other. This is really the case now, because every time, you look up there and you see a Boeing 787 Dreamliner cruise past, it's made predominantly of composites, carbon fibre and stuff like that. And that is many, many dozens of tons of aluminium that are not up there carrying people around. And all of that aluminium and the industry that manufactures it is looking for somewhere else to go, which is why the new Ford F-150 pickup is made predominantly of aluminium. And this is a lot different to an Audi A8 or an S-Class or an E-Class Benz or something like that, because there are so many F-150s in production, whatever it is, 700,000 a year or something. That's a lot of aluminium displacing the steel. The reason for using aluminium, of course, is because it's a whole lot lighter. So you think to yourself, what does the steel industry do and what does the car industry do generally? What they've got to do is they've got to meet their fuel economy targets. And obviously the easiest way to save fuel is just to make cars lighter. And that's okay, except if you want an SUV size car, you're not going to be happy with a Yaris, right? So we can't just say, new regulation, everyone's going to drive microcars, because that won't work. What car makers are challenged by is making cars the same size or even bigger, but also delivering the fuel economy standards that regulators want and that consumers expect, lower fuel consumption, and at the same time, not compromising on the weight or the performance or the size of the cars. So what they're doing now is they're kind of going from steel used in the bodywork that is 0.9 of a millimetre or a millimetre thick, and they're trying to trend down to about 0.5 millimetre in thickness. And that seems like a simple enough assignment, although unless you change the composition of the steel fundamentally, it's not going to be strong enough to do the job. So you have to change the alloys, and you can put a whole bunch of interesting things in steel. You can use chromium and molybdenum and make that chrome moly steel that we've heard of for roll cages and things like that. Although chrome moly does tend to be pretty expensive, and in a mass production context for making millions of automobiles every year, that's not going to work. So instead what they do is they try silicon and manganese, which are much more affordable alloying elements to deliver the required strength. Small problem there though. When you anneal the steel after it's manufactured, it oxidizes the silicon, and when you get silicon oxides, they're basically sand, and those oxides sort of gravitate to the outside of the steel sheet, and zinc will not stick to that. So that's kind of bad from a galvanizing point of view. So what you've got to do then is you've got to change the composition of steel and use a whole bunch of interesting metallurgy. I don't know exactly how they do it, and perhaps that's a trade secret, but what they do now is they try and anneal that steel at low temperatures, like 640 degrees C, which is quite low for the annealing process. Metallurgy for dummies, when we're talking about annealing steel, what we're doing is we're kind of de-stressing it and making it easier to work with. So you roll up your steel sheet and you manufacture that nice thin sheet to make the automobile from. Then what you do is you put it in an oven and you anneal it to reduce the internal stresses and change the crystallization structure inside the steel. You make it a whole bunch easier to work with. And what you've got then is a steel that will kind of roll out nice and easily and be pressed into shape, and it'll tolerate all of the demands that go into pressing those crisp cut lines into the bodies and folding it over those tight radii to get all those smooth edges and curves. It'll tolerate that. But basically this is the real challenge facing the steel industry. They're fighting on the back foot against aluminium. Aluminium's fighting on the back foot against composites. And the winner is ultimately the consumer, because you're going to end up with a lighter car that's the same size. It's going to deliver the performance you want and have the space you need inside it. And it's also not going to rust for 20 or 30 years. And you can bet your bottom dollar that the zinc industry is going to be lobbying very hard as well in places like China and India, where they don't routinely galvanize their cars. And basically that's important to them because It's a massive industry. You know, the amount of zinc being used to protect your car and every other car manufactured in the developed world and sold this year is about 120,000 tonnes of zinc. So you can bet that's a big, fat, vested commercial interest, and they're not going to be giving up that game without a fight. But if you've ever wondered why your car today does not rust in the way that Kingswoods and Falcons and Tiranas and Geminis and all of those cars that I grew up with in the 70s, we don't get those rusty blisters and cars just last for a whole lot longer without the cancer of rust, it's because they've been galvanised for nearly 30 years. And if you live in Canada or somewhere like that and you're shouting at the computer screen and you're saying, yeah, well, that's simply because you've got zinc versus salt, and ultimately the zinc is gonna lose. Anyway, we're on the fly at the moment, so that's all the time I've got for you today. I hope I haven't put you to sleep with the secret life of metals in cars. I hope you've learned something. If you have, you might want to subscribe. I thank you for your interest. I'm John Cadogan. Thanks for watching.